raging between Beijing and Washington, regional integration is gaining momentum rapidly for China and ASEAN. Does the 10-member ASEAN have to take sides when Washington seeks to adopt a confrontational existence with China? What is ASEAN's stance on anti-globalization trends? And is China's Greater Bay Area an important issue for Asia's competitiveness? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined by Professor Tan Ki-Gia, the co-director of the Asia Competitive Institute at the National University of Singapore. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, sir. So what can you tell us about the importance of having this mil-to-mil ties between Singapore and China?
We all want stability in South China Sea. We don't want any accidents. So having more cooperation, of course, is better than less. And given the China-US trade war, ASEAN is so important. We need not only political stability and also military stability among major powers. So I think this kind of cooperation is to be encouraged because it has serious economic implications to the rest of the Asia region, ASEAN especially.
Today, however, the Trump administration decides, and in cooperation with the opposition party of Democrats in the D.C., to disengage, to sever its relationship, economic and in many other areas, from with the PRC. So does it mean automatically that Singapore, along with other member states of ASEAN, will have to take sides?
We will not take sides, but Singapore, like the rest of the ASEAN nations, we make it very clear. We want the rule-based globalization where the established international order ought not to be disrupted. I think in the case of the United States, the President Trump basically, I think, to me, is an outlier among the past President of the United States. So what he has done, for example, tariff to China and also to Mexico, and also to withdraw the generalized system of preferential trade treatment to India. These are disruption to international orders, whether it's in terms of trade, economics, or finance. So I think we will not choose sides. And our understanding is we were told we no need to choose sides, but there are certain principles that we want to uphold.
For example, what are the principles?
Rule-based engagement through the WTO process and regional free trade agreement, whether it's CPTPP or RCEP or FTAAP, so that we can push globalization further. Because it has gone beyond reasonable doubt that greater free trade among nations will improve the quality of life of the majority, although there might be income disparity. These are problems of success which can be addressed. So these are the basic principles that Singapore upheld as one of the most open economy in the world, where our trade is 3 times our GDP.
No one believes American policymakers are stupid. They must be aware clearly that China, along with other 3 major players in Northeast Asia, Japan and South Korea, respect the centrality of ASEAN. And therefore, it will be very difficult to divide and rule among member states of ASEAN. In this case, what do you think of the tone that Acting Secretary Patrick Shanahan set for his presentation?
I think it was well known that Minister Mentor Lee Kuan Yew, when he was alive, it wanted U.S. to continue to be engaged with Asia Pacific. I think he made it very clear economically. But now we are seeing the engagement is lopsided, more of military than economics. For example, withdrawing from the TPP, which is now known as CPTPP, it's just one classic example. So I think we want U.S. To do by actions that bring back the investment to ASEAN in the scale that they used to do. Equally for Japanese as well. Japanese left ASEAN for mainland China in the 1990s, and we want these Japanese multinational to come back too, and the Korean multinational. Now, I think it is important we qualify. We want the major economic power to come back to ASEAN in investments and economics to balance one another. but not to counter China.
Just as Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said in his opening remarks that Singapore is too small to influence major powers. When you say you will do whatever you can to attract the multinationals from neighboring economies to come back, what can you do to leverage the resources?
No, that is one of the biggest conceptions about the smallness of Singapore. In terms of geographical size, we are small. Let me quote to you the latest statistic from International Monetary Fund in the year 2017. This is the latest statistics available. Singapore is number one in terms of receiving foreign direct investment. As of 2017, 70 billions. China is 40 billions and Indonesia 12.5 billions. But in terms of contributing for foreign direct investment, we are number two after Japan. 100 over billions, and United States is the poor third. So how can you say Singapore is small? But in terms of trade and investment, we are top one and top number two, whether it's in terms of receiving FDI or in contributing to FDI. And being a very open economy, we speak very loud in front of anyone on globalization, on transparency and rule-based regional free trade agreement. So I think we do have some important role to play in as far as trade and investment globally.
What job does your institute, the Asia Competitive Institute, do to assess the economic strength of major players in Asia?
Yeah, we study the competitiveness of major economies in Asia, not at national level, but at subnational level, which means we study 34 greater China economies, 35 states of India, 34 provinces of Indonesia and ASEAN 10. So you can see we are looking at subnational level, and obviously we understand what it takes to be most competitive. If I can quote you the latest statistic by Pacific Economic of Cooperation Council, of which I'm the Singapore chairman, that the latest ranking of connectivity, economic connectivity in the world, Singapore ranked number one. So in other words,
you have surpassed Hong Kong to become number one.
Yes, connectivity. And in terms of economic competitiveness, we're also number one. Why? Because as I told you just now, we follow the rule-based, we are for globalization, we are for growth. And any income disparity, this is a problem of success, which we are not afraid to look after. So in other words, that we want to tell the rest of the world, you can be small, but you can be big in trade and investment, but you must stay competitive, which means you must have good governance. Singapore is almost corruption-free. We have strong governance, transparency, and rule-based engagement in trade investment.
When you look at the completion of a major bridge that connects Hong Kong with Macau and the 9 cities in Canton, it's what we call the Grand Bay Area. Such a process of a regional economic integration will certainly help Hong Kong to catch up, if not to surpass Singapore in what is called a benevolent competition in this region. What do you think of the prospects of Hong Kong in this sub-regional context?
Well, the Great Bay Area is something which we, Singapore, are looking very close into. In fact, we are envious of Hong Kong and Macau to be in that position. We wish we are Hong Kong, so near to mainland China in this Great Bay Area, which is a great initiative.
Deputy Prime Minister of your country and Minister for Finance Heng Swee-Keat said recently, greater cooperation with China on the Belt and Road Initiative would enhance interconnection across the region. And when Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong was at the BRI forum in April, the Singaporean government signed the memorandums of understanding on bilateral cooperation. Will that seriously upset Washington, which speaks negatively of BRI as part of what they call conspiracy theory?
Now, that's precisely the point I articulated earlier on. Singapore is not afraid of offending big power. If Singapore sees something which are good for the people in the region, in the case of Belt and Road Initiative, we were the first, one of the very first to support Belt and Road Initiative. We are one of the first to support the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Why are we putting our support so strongly behind the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank? Because we recognize in developing countries there are 3 bottlenecks: financing bottleneck, infrastructure bottleneck, and production bottlenecks. So if Belt and Road Initiative is going to open up the infrastructure bottleneck, and if the AIIB Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is going to open up the financing bottleneck for development of ASEAN and Asia. Why not Singapore support? Because Singapore, we are the economic hub. So when it comes to supporting the core interests of the people in the region, we don't look at the face of the big power. We tell them very openly, this is good for the region. You may not like it, but we do it in a very open way. I want to take this opportunity to say that currently what the Americans are doing, initiated this trade war, is a great disruption to international order. For example, the global production chains is based on competitive trade advantage. Now, if what the United States did to, say, Huawei, for example, resulted in many big economies decided to have all the various stages of production within their own economy. And that would disrupt the production value chain in Southeast Asia. And I think that is bad news. And it will become more costly if big economies like China or United States or Japan decided to have all the production processes within their own country. I think that will mean bad news for developing countries, because then we cannot be part of this globalization. And this is very selfish. This is a wrong leadership that the American is showing. But unfortunately, China would have to retaliate. I think by the end of the day, not only the two major powers will end up losing, but I think developing countries which are trying to catch up will lose even more. And that's not fair. So that is why we urge major powers, you can't be selfish. You've got to be rational. You can't be emotional about things.
Acting Defense Chief of Pentagon, Mr. Patrick Shanahan, spoke positively of Singaporean government in his reference to the defense cooperation between the two militaries. That might include an exchange of intelligence reports. And therefore, when your government made it very clear that Singapore would not dismiss Huawei, neither would a Malaysian government such as Dr. Mahathir would dismiss Huawei. So what do you think will be the consequences as a result of your defiance?
Well, I think sometimes people talk about things they over-exaggerated. For example, if exchanging information on terrorism is not of a U.S. interest, not to share important information about terrorism in this part of the world or with Singapore, I think they will certainly share, because this is also to their core interest too. So I would say that sometimes we do not have to pay too much attention for this kind of rhetoric talk. But by the end of the day, when it affects the interests of two countries, I'm sure vital information will be shared. And as far as Singapore is concerned, we are not there to contain China or block the technological advancement of China, which cannot be helped. If Huawei really turned out to be much more advanced in terms of 5G and other aspects of technology advancement, why should not Singapore take advantage of it? Bearing in mind, we are the economic, maritime, aviation, logistic, telecommunication, financial hub of Asia. We cannot be behind in terms of technology. We must acquire the state of the art of technology. And if American or China have that advanced technology, so be it. We're quite happy to embrace them.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Tan Ki Giap, co-director of the Asia Competitiveness Institute with the National University of Singapore. I'm very happy to interview him during my recent stay in Singapore to cover the Shangri-La Dialogue. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Is it an easy job to find an alternative partner after Huawei were to be taken out by Washington in what is called the new Cold War?
It's not about alternative partners. It's about identifying the leaders, whether it's in technology or in trade or in investment. And I give you an example of production value change. It's also not easy to disrupt production value change by moving everything to another economies, because these production value chains take many decades to build up. Just like Huawei or any leaders in technology, they are here today, not because they were here yesterday. This has been the building up of it over decades. So I think it's not a question of finding an alternative, but rather to embrace what the latest technology, of course, with regard to our security, national security or core interests of Singapore remain paramount.
How likely will the world see the creation of a bipolar world technologically, with Huawei assuming leadership in China and other developing as well as emerging markets, with Europeans and Americans creating their own parallel market in terms of, for example, the 5G tele infrastructure?
Well, if that happened, it will be a sad world because it will be a much more expensive world. And I think the advancement of technology would be minimized because of the separate or fragmented market. So we think if this trend continue to go on, a more serious economic recession may take place, and perhaps we need a strong knock on the major powers for them to wake up that at the rate they are going, they are causing misery for majority of the people in the world. And if you are the biggest economy, in the case of the United States, or you're the second biggest economy in terms of China, as a global leader, you have the moral duty to not just advance your own interests, but the interests of the developing world. Now, if you can't do that, you cannot be a global leader.
Professor Tam, this week the US has added the Southeast Asian countries, including Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam, to a watch list for currency manipulation, putting their foreign exchange policies under scrutiny. So how do you see this move by the US government, or why has the US put Singapore on the list?
Well, we are also very surprised indeed, and Singapore, we certainly don't play around with our exchange rate. But I say you have to have this big background that globally, civilizations are very different, and each have our own values and way of life. The moment any big power trying to impose their value system to these different civilizations, whether it's the Arabs or the Chinese or the Southeast Asian, then you're bound to have this kind of conflict which intensify. Arab Spring, for example, it was regarded as something so positive for Middle East. But you look at what's happening now, things get worse. So in terms of Chinese Communist Party, after so many decades, I think you have your own political agenda to follow. So if any big power trying to impose, or even in the brand of Singapore democracy, so to speak, I think that is not in line with our values. Or, for example, the West is very high tolerance for this LGBT. But in Singapore, in Asian society, we are not. So long as you try to impose your values in all this such a wide range of area, whether it's democracy, LGBT, or even trade or investment, I think that will create a lot of tension, which are, I think, unnecessary. So however big or small, different civilization and values in life, they ought to be respected, although you may not agree with them. I think you have to get on the right footing, otherwise it will be a terrible world.
More and more Chinese policymakers are discussing the importance of the Malacca Strait in times of crisis. What's the position of the Singaporean government on maritime stakes?
Straits of Malacca, of course, is very important to Singapore. As you know, we are a maritime hub of Asia. So therefore, it is of Singapore interest to see peaceful and freedom of navigation in Straits of Malacca, which up to now, we don't see much problem. But I think any attempt to cause tension, even in Straits of Malacca, not to mention South China Sea, is not to the interest, especially to those ASEAN countries in this region, because we need economic development, we need catching up, and there are rising middle class in ASEAN as well, whether it's in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and in Thailand. So we need prolonged period of prosperity where economics flourish, and where jobs are created, and when people can be innovative and entrepreneurial. I think this is what we look towards to major powers. Come here to promote trade and investment, but not to add on tension, not to cause deepen conflicts among us. I think in terms of code of conduct, ASEAN 10 are negotiating I think, progressing well with China. So I think this, you can see there are hopeful signs that nobody wants wars. And I think the only way to prevent it, we must continue to engage one another constructively. I mean, look at ASEAN. Myanmar was under military government, and Singapore continued to have constructive engagement with Myanmar, even though we have different political system. We continue to deal very well with Vietnam, even though it's a communist regime. So I think it is very important within Southeast Asia, we respect each other's system and their value in life. And therefore, we want the rest of the regional power to do the same, and not to stir up conflict, but to preserve the harmony that we have been having for so many decades.
Do you think it's China or the US that violates the rules-based world, which meant so much for the co-prosperity of the world?
Well, I think if you look at the WTO system, since 1995, 500 disputes has been surfaced by 50 nations involving 20 agreements, and most of them are settled through negotiation or sometimes the rule applications. So we think WTO system is still working, and people appreciate it. So be it China or United States, instead of subjectively raising tariffs, their grievances should refer to WTO. WTO may take too long, but I think, yes, you should try to make the system even better. So the point I want to make is this. So long as one person wants to pick up the fight, if the other person remains cool, then it's quite difficult for it to explode. So far we can see that my observation is China has been rather reserved compared to the more flamboyant approach by President Trump. So I think if with this kind of approach, I find that it's much more difficult to pick up a fight. And I think it's the same between ASEAN and China. If ASEAN do not want to confront China to pick up a fight.
What do you think will be the end game for the two biggest economies?
What I worry most, if with this animosity between China and United States, and later on this transpire to people animosity, and if that happens, it will take a long time to correct. So up till now, I think, before President Trump came in, I think the Chinese basically speak very much in favor of the United States. You can look at the number of students having education in the United States, or the tourism, the kind of multinational from the United States in China. But what we are afraid that if this kind of animosity, whether it's in terms of trade dispute or tax dispute or effort to contain China, if that goes too long, and it filters down to the people, and nationalism eventually picks up. And once this happens, it will take many, many more years to go back to the good relationship in the past. Now, this is our greatest fear.
Yes, trade deficit is one obstacle, but most important, devastating is the lack of mutual trust. That's the most serious obstacle, the trust deficit that gets in the way. The United States has dismissed the reform of WTO, and particularly the Court of Appeal in a settlement of the disputes. We're going to wait to see what happens next down the road. Thank you very much for being part of this meaningful dialogue.
Yeah, if I may add, I don't think this is trust deficit between the two economies. It is the number one economy, that's the United States. I'm not prepared to see the number two overtaking him. So it's not so much a trust deficit, but it's a very defensive move to want to maintain your number one position. But as an economist, I will tell you, eventually market will decide, and the global markets will tell over time. So this deficit, whether it's trade deficit or budget deficit, of course it's not sustainable.
And we are wondering aloud if what's happening between Washington and Beijing is a war between Caucasian nations and a country that is viewed as alien culture. I will see you next time. Until then, goodbye.